The Shadows of Versailles.
The year was 1919 and Europe was bleeding. The cannons of the Great War had fallen silent, but the silence was uneasy, like the calm that follows a storm that promises to return. In the grand halls in Versailles, the victors of World War I gathered to shape the new world. Germany, broken and humiliated, was forced to sign a treaty that stripped it of land, pride, and dignity. The ink that sealed the Treaty of Versailles also sowed the seeds of another, far greater war. Meanwhile, in the East, a nation long erased from maps reawakened, Poland. After more than a century of partition, Poland rose again in 1918, patching together fragments of territories taken by Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Its people sang songs of freedom, but their joy was tempered by the challenges of rebuilding from ruin. Borders were uncertain, enemies were many, and allies were few. In Germany, resentment festered like an open wound. Veterans returned home to hunger and shame, whispering of betrayal and vengeance. Out of this bitterness emerged a man who promised salvation, Adolf Hitler. Charismatic and ruthless, he spoke to the wounded pride of a nation, preaching that Germany's destiny was to rise again. Europe looked on, weary and hopeful, believing that peace could hold. But beneath the treaties and promises, darker ambitions stirred. The stage was being set, quietly and irresistibly, for a tragedy that would engulf the world once more. The ashes of the last war had barely cooled, and already the fire was beginning to burn again.
The Gathering Storm. By the mid-1930s, the world had convinced itself that the Great War had been the war to end all wars. Yet, in the heart of Europe, a restless Germany was awakening. Adolf Hitler, now Führer, had turned his words into weapons. His speeches filled stadiums, his promises rekindled hope in the desperate, and his armies began to march again, first quietly, then boldly. In 1936, German troops marched into the demilitarized Rhineland, defying the Treaty of Versailles. The world protested, but no one stopped them. Encouraged, Hitler pressed further. Austria was absorbed into the Reich in 1938, an event he called the Anschluss, the reunion of German-speaking peoples. Crowds cheered and Europe looked on, uncertain and unwilling to fight. Then came Czechoslovakia. Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, claiming to protect ethnic Germans there. Britain's Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, desperate to preserve peace, flew to Munich and returned with a promise signed by Hitler himself, peace for our time. The ink had barely dried when Hitler seized the rest of Czechoslovakia. Now only Poland stood in his way. To the German people, Hitler spoke of the lost lands, territories that had once belonged to Germany but were now part of Poland, West Prussia, Posen, and especially the free city of Danzig, modern-day Gdansk. He claimed Germans there were oppressed. In Warsaw, the Polish government refused to bend. "We will not give an inch," they declared. They had heard Hitler's promises before and knew what they were worth. As summer 1939 approached, Europe held its breath. Armies trained, borders bristled, diplomats whispered behind closed doors. Thunderclouds gathered over the continent, and deep inside them, lightning waited. The storm was coming, and when it broke, the world would never be the same again.
The Pact with the Devil. In the heat of August 1939, as Europe teetered on the edge of war, two men who despised each other prepared to make a deal. Adolf Hitler, the sworn enemy of communism, and Joseph Stalin, the architect of the Soviet Revolution, found common ground in greed. Both wanted land, power, and time. Their foreign ministers, Joachim von Ribbentrop and Vyacheslav Molotov, met in Moscow on a tense August night. Champagne glasses clinked under the glow of chandeliers as they signed a non-aggression pact. The world saw only the public treaty, a promise that Germany and the Soviet Union would not attack one another. But hidden in the shadows was a secret protocol, a quiet map of betrayal. On that secret map, Poland was split like prey between two predators. Germany would take the West, the Soviets the East. The Baltic states and Finland were marked for Stalin, while Hitler's eyes fixed on Danzig and beyond. It was a pact of convenience, an alliance born of lies and destined for blood. When news of the pact reached the world, shock rippled through every capital. Hitler's enemies and Stalin's allies were stunned. Poland, caught in the middle, suddenly found itself surrounded. British and French diplomats scrambled, offering guarantees of protection, but in truth they were too far away and too slow. In Berlin, Hitler smiled. With the Soviets neutralized, he could strike Poland without fear of a two-front war. His generals finalized Fall Weiss, Case White, the plan to invade Poland. The soldiers were ready, the tanks were fueled, and the orders were signed. On the night of August 31st, 1939, as German operatives staged a fake attack near the Polish border to justify invasion, Europe stood on the cliff's edge. At dawn, the world would plunge into war.
The Morning of Fire. The 1st of September, 1939, a date the world would never forget. Dawn crept over the Baltic Sea, and with it came thunder. At 4:45 a.m., the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein, anchored peacefully in the port of Danzig, suddenly opened fire on the Polish garrison at Westerplatte. Shells exploded against the fortifications, shaking the ground and tearing through the still morning air. It was the first shot of World War II. At the same time, across more than 1,500 miles of border, German tanks, troops, and bombers poured into Poland. The invasion was codenamed Fall Weiss, Case White. But to those who felt its fury, it had no name. It was chaos unleashed. The new German tactic, Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, struck with terrifying speed. Armored divisions slashed through Polish defenses, while the Luftwaffe rained death from the skies. Cities like Wieland and Lodz were bombed mercilessly. Civilians fled in panic as villages burned and roads clogged with refugees and soldiers alike. In Warsaw, air raid sirens wailed as explosions echoed across the city. Radios crackled with confusion. Some still believed it was a border skirmish that would soon end. But as the day unfolded, the truth became impossible to deny. The Germans had come to conquer, not to negotiate. Hitler addressed the Reichstag that morning, claiming Poland had attacked first. It was a lie, built on staged provocations, including a fake Polish raid on a German radio station. Yet, it gave him his excuse. For the Polish people, there was no time for politics, only survival. Farmers grabbed rifles. Soldiers manned crumbling defenses. Children were sent to hide in forests. The world had fallen asleep in uneasy peace and awoke in flames. The morning of fire had begun, and it would burn for years to come.
Poland's defiant stand.
From the first hours of invasion, Poland's fate seemed sealed, but its spirit refused to yield. Against the might of Hitler's mechanized armies, the Polish forces fought with courage that astonished even their enemies. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and outflanked. Yes, they stood their ground wherever they could, turning fields, forests, and villages into battlegrounds. At the borders, soldiers of the Polish army engaged in desperate fights, retreating only when overrun. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies, bombing railways, bridges, and columns of refugees. Yet Polish pilots, flying outdated planes, managed daring victories in dogfights over Warsaw and Krakow. They fought knowing each sortie might be their last. One of the most enduring legends was born near Kroyante, where Polish cavalry charged a German infantry unit. The myth said they charged tanks, a symbol of bravery against impossible odds. In truth, the cavalry scattered infantry before being ambushed by armored cars. Still, the story captured the essence of Poland's defiance, courage when logic said there should be none. In Warsaw, civilians joined the fight. Volunteers built barricades, carried ammunition, and dug trenches in parks and streets. Priests blessed soldiers heading to the front. Mothers wept but sent their sons anyway, whispering, "For Poland." The soldiers knew they couldn't win, but they fought not for victory. They fought for honor, for the belief that some things must be defended, even in the face of doom. As German tanks encircled more cities, resistance stiffened instead of fading. The Polish commander-in-chief, Marshal Edward Rydz-Migły, urged his troops to fall back eastward, hoping to regroup. No one yet knew that a second enemy waited there, one that would strike soon. For now, Poland burned, but it still stood, defiant in defeat, proud in tragedy.
The world reacted. While Poland fought for its life, the world watched with a mix of outrage and hesitation. In London and Paris, news of the invasion spread like wildfire. Radio broadcasts carried the grim reports: German tanks rolling across the plains, cities burning, refugees flooding the roads. Crowds gathered outside government buildings demanding action. On September 3, 1939, Britain and France finally declared war on Germany. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's voice trembled as he addressed the British people. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note. The note had gone unanswered. The two great Western powers were now officially at war. Yet for Poland, those words brought no relief. The Allied armies remained motionless behind the Maginot Line, a wall of concrete and steel that symbolized their caution and their fear. Though technically at war, the West launched no major offensive. This strange period would later be called the Phony War, when soldiers waited in trenches while Poland bled alone. In Warsaw, people listened to foreign radio, desperate for news. "France has declared war," someone shouted in the streets. For a brief moment, hope flickered. Perhaps Allied bombers would soon arrive. Perhaps German forces would be forced to retreat. But days passed, and nothing came. Meanwhile, the German war machine pressed deeper. Poland's allies had spoken but not acted. Diplomats made speeches, governments mobilized slowly, and the League of Nations proved powerless once again. Inside Hitler's headquarters, the Führer smirked. His gamble had paid off. The West had blustered, but not bitten. He now saw that the world would not move fast enough to save Poland. And so the invasion continued, merciless and unstoppable. The world had declared war, but Poland still stood alone in the fire.
The second invasion. Just when Poland's defenders thought the nightmare could not deepen, it did, on the morning of September 17, 1939, as the sun rose over the forests and plains of eastern Poland, a new wave of soldiers appeared, not in gray German uniforms, but in the olive drab of the Red Army. Without warning, the Soviet Union invaded from the east. Stalin's troops swept across the border under the pretense of protecting Ukrainian and Belarusian minorities. But the truth was written months earlier in the secret pact signed with Hitler. Poland, already fighting for its life in the West, was now struck from behind. Polish commanders were stunned, communications broke down, orders were confused. Some units still believed the Soviets had come as allies. Within hours, that illusion shattered as Soviet tanks fired on Polish positions and aircraft strafed retreating columns. Marshal Ryd-Sumigli gave his final order: do not engage the Soviets, escape to Romania and Hungary if possible. Poland will never surrender, but her sons must live to fight another day. Thousands of soldiers and civilians fled south, carrying what little they could, hoping to regroup abroad. Meanwhile, chaos engulfed the countryside. German and Soviet troops sometimes met in eerie camaraderie, shaking hands, exchanging cigarettes, and marking new borders as Poland's body was divided before its people's eyes. For the Polish people, betrayal hung heavy in the air. Their two most powerful neighbors, who had promised peace, had conspired to erase their nation once again. Families were torn apart. Officers captured by the Soviets were marched eastward into captivity, many never to return. In just over 2 weeks, Poland's fate was sealed. The country that had risen from ashes in 1918 was once more being buried beneath the boots of tyrants.
The fall of Warsaw.
By late September 1939, Poland's heart, Warsaw, stood alone. The city was surrounded, battered and burning, yet still defiant. German forces had encircled the capital, pounding it daily with artillery and aerial bombardments. The sky above was a storm of smoke and flame. Every sunrise brought new ruin, every sunset new graves. Inside the city, chaos and courage lived side by side. Soldiers, policemen, and civilians fought together, turning streets into barricades and apartment blocks into fortresses. Children carried messages through sewers. Women tended to the wounded in basements that served as hospitals. Water was scarce, food scarcer still, but the will to resist never wavered. The Luftwaffe showed no mercy. Bombs rained down on markets, churches, and hospitals. Fires devoured whole districts, yet amid the destruction, the Polish flag still fluttered above the royal castle. General Julius Rommel commanded what remained of the defense, vowing to fight until the last bullet, until the last man. Foreign journalists trapped in the city sent desperate reports to the outside world. Warsaw is dying, but she refuses to bow. Those words traveled across continents, stirring sympathy but no rescue. The Allies were too far, their armies unmoving behind distant lines. After nearly 4 weeks of siege, on September 27th, Warsaw could bear no more. With civilians starving and the city reduced to rubble, Rommel agreed to surrender to prevent further slaughter. 2 days later, German troops marched through the smoking ruins in grim triumph. But victory was hollow. The defiance of Warsaw had shown the world that Poland's heart would not break easily. Even as the Nazi flag rose over the city, whispers of resistance began to spread underground. Warsaw had fallen, but her spirit had not.
Division and occupation. When the guns fell silent over Warsaw, the victors moved quickly to divide their prize. Germany and the Soviet Union met to redraw the map of Eastern Europe, their soldiers shaking hands along the Bug River, a grotesque celebration of conquest. Poland, once again, was wiped from existence. In the West, Hitler's rule descended like a shadow. The German-occupied zone was renamed the General Government, ruled by fear and cruelty. Cities were renamed, Polish culture suppressed, and schools closed. Intellectuals, priests, and officers were rounded up and executed. The Nazi plan was simple: to erase Poland's identity, leaving behind only obedient laborers for the Reich. In the East, Stalin's rule was no kinder. Soviet troops marched Polish officers and civilians deep into the forests and gulags of the USSR. Families were separated, land seized, and anyone labeled bourgeois or anti-Soviet vanished into the night. In secret, over 20,000 Polish officers and intelligentsia would later be murdered by the NKVD, their bodies buried in the forests of Katyn. Yet even as both occupiers sought to destroy Poland's soul, they could not. Underground newspapers began to circulate. Secret schools formed in basements to keep the Polish language alive. The government in exile, first in France and later in London, vowed to continue the fight. Polish pilots would soon fly in the Battle of Britain, and soldiers would fight in Norway, North Africa, and Italy, carrying their white and red flag wherever freedom still flickered. For the people left behind, survival became an act of resistance. To speak Polish, to pray, to remember, all were defiant acts against tyranny. The invaders had divided Poland's land, but its heart, its faith, and its will to resist, those remained unbroken, burning quietly beneath the ashes of occupation.
Echoes of resistance and memory.
Though Poland's land was conquered, its spirit refused to die. Beneath the watchful eyes of occupiers, a secret nation was reborn, invisible but alive. Teachers taught lessons in candlelit basements. Couriers carried messages through forests and sewers. Soldiers without uniforms gathered in cellars, swearing oaths to a homeland that no longer existed on maps. This was the Polish resistance, one of the largest and bravest underground movements in all of occupied Europe. They called themselves the Armia Krajowa, the Home Army. From the ruins of defeat, they built a network of hope. They sabotaged trains, smuggled intelligence to the Allies, and even printed newspapers under the noses of their oppressors. Every act, no matter how small, was a declaration, Poland lives. Abroad, the struggle continued. Polish pilots soared in the skies of Britain, their fighter planes marked with white and red checkerboards. At Monte Cassino, Polish troops climbed cliffs under fire to raise their flag over the monastery ruins. In every theater of war, Poles fought not just for victory, but for home. But victory came at a terrible cost. When the war ended in 1945, Poland's cities were shattered, its people scarred. Millions were dead, soldiers, civilians, Jews, families wiped out in ghettos and camps. And though Germany was defeated, Poland's freedom was again stolen, this time by the Soviet hand that claimed to have liberated it. Yet the memory of September 1939 endured. It became a symbol, not only of tragedy, but of courage, a reminder that a nation's soul cannot be conquered by force alone. From the ashes of invasion rose a story of defiance and faith, whispered from one generation to the next. Poland had fallen, but it had never surrendered, and it never would.